It's really nice to see you, Andre.
It's really nice to see you too, Dr. Zahir. So hello, everyone, and welcome to tonight's event. My name is Andre, and I have a couple of quick announcements before we introduce this evening's speaker. If you can't stay with us for the whole event tonight, that's not a problem. After the event is over, a recording will be available on our Facebook page as well as our YouTube channel. Dr. Zahir will not be taking questions tonight. If you have joined us on Zoom, your video and microphone will remain off during tonight's event. So tonight we have one of our very favorite speakers with us, Dr. Max Zahir. Dr. Max Zahir is a Rhodes Scholar, an author, a retired physician, and a Kamloops resident. I believe this is his third time speaking with us, and I'll give you a little bit more background. So Dr. Zahir was born in the Indian province of Punjab in 1936 and was about 10 years old when India achieved its independence in 1947. Sorry, I've got one more person, it being admitted to the waiting room. There we go. So as a part of this change, India was divided into two countries, India and Pakistan. This event forced millions of people, including Dr. Zahir's family, to flee India into Pakistan or be killed for their religious beliefs. Partition has been described as the greatest loss of civilian life in human history in the absence of war or famine. Now, Max has written about his family's experience in a 2009 book entitled 1947, A Memoir of Indian Independence. This book is available in our libraries, and you can watch a recording of his talk with us on our 2017 Facebook page. Sorry, from 2017 on our Facebook page. Now, 73 years later, Dr. Zahir sees a new danger affecting his homeland, the climate crisis. Under the current conditions, the climate crisis is expected to affect 800 million people in South Asia, by far the largest concentration of humanity so far affected. Tonight, Dr. Zahir will take us on a journey of his experiences surviving one catastrophe and living on the cusp of another. And so, without further ado, welcome, Dr. Zahir, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Andre.
You're more than welcome.
So I continue. Okay, thank you very much, everyone. It was September last year, 2019, and I was standing in a checkout line in one of the stores in Kamloops. I caught sight of the Time magazine on the rack. And the cover of the Time magazine said, what it is like living in one of the hottest cities on earth, where it may soon be uninhabitable. So one of the hottest cities in the world, I was curious. I grew up in the hottest part of India, which is Northwest, and have visited many hot places in the Middle East. So I wanted to know what the magazine, the article was all about. I bought the magazine and took it home. And the city, to my surprise, was Jacobabad, which is now in Pakistan. I had been there. I knew Jacobabad very well. In early 50s, my family lived not far from Jacobabad. The city, Jacobabad, was created out of desert in 1847 by John Jacob, who left England for India at the age of 16 and never returned. He is buried in Jacobabad, and his grave is fondly tended by the people there. He brought water to the desert. Jacobabad was a scorching desert. He brought water to the desert by digging canals from Indus River. And he irrigated the land and invited people from other parts of India and to come and live there. The grateful citizens named the city after him, Jacobabad, which means city of Jacob. The central clock tower in the city, which he built, still stands there, and the clock which he imported from Britain still works. Also, the multi-story dovecote, which he built is still there and hosts more than 300 pigeons. It was 52 degrees Celsius when the writer of the article visited Jacobabad. The temperature had reached over 53 some while before, and 8 newborn babies had died in the intensive care unit in the hospital because the power had temporarily shut down. The heat in those areas is not for a day or two. It is week after week, month after month, relentless, from late March to late October. And most of the people have, of course, no air conditioning. I thought I knew about the summer heat. But in early 50s, when I lived with my family, the temperature rarely went above 47 degrees Celsius. Even then, everything shut down in summer in the afternoon. The shops were shuttered, the school closed, birds in the trees fell asleep, and the dogs underneath were asleep. My father was the only doctor in the town, the government town in that hospital. And in the summer, he constantly dealt with people with dehydration, heat stroke, and heat exhaustion. And now temperature was 53 degrees Celsius. Honestly, I didn't want to think about it. I quote the article from Time. It is just after 7 a.m. in Jacobabad, and donkey car driver Ahsan Husul is already drenched in sweat. For the past 2 hours, the 24-hour laborer has been hauling jugs of drinking water to local residences. When the water invariably spills from the blue jerry cans, it hits the pavement with an audible hiss and turns to steam. It is hot, he agrees, but that is no excuse to stop. The heat will only increase as the day wears on. And what choice does he have? Even if it were so hot as if the land were on fire, we would keep working, he says. When the Time reporter at the end of the assignment asked a climate scientist at the University of Hawaii what the new normal for heat in Europe will look like, he laughed. The new normal for Europe, he said, is likely to look like Jacobabad. And it's not just heat. Last time I visited Lahore in Pakistan in summer, it's the second largest city in Pakistan with a population now of 12 million. I stayed in an air-conditioned hotel. The moment I stepped out, I was hit, not only by heat, but by air too. Heat was unbearable, air unbreathable. Air pollution may not appear to be linked to climate crisis, but it's very much part of it. Many in Lahore complain of headaches, burning eyes, and congested throats as the air levels on some days hit 5 times the legal limit. Lahore, once known as the Garden City, is now choked with cars and regularly figures on air quality indexes as one of the most polluted cities in the world. And many of the pollutants are also drivers of climate change. Pakistan uses the most polluted fuel because it's cheap. Brick kiln users use the dirtiest technology, such as burning used tires in their kilns because they are cheap. And farmers burn crop stubble because it's the cheapest way to get rid of it. On heavily polluted days, a prominent Lahore lawyer runs 3 purifiers around the clock, 3 air purifiers, keeps his windows shut and stuffs towels into the gaps between his doors and does not send his daughter to school. Amnesty International writes, and I quote, levels of air quality in Lahore from October to January reaches hazardous levels most of the time, where people are advised to avoid all physical activities outdoors. This is neither a new problem nor one that came without warning. Low-income workers such as laborers, construction workers, farmhands, and marginalized groups are particularly vulnerable as the nature of their work makes them work outdoors. Government's failure to protect such people violates their human rights to life and health, unquote. According to a medical report, whopping 22% of annual deaths in Pakistan are caused by pollution, air pollution and water pollution. But I found a positive note of sorts in a recent newspaper from Lahore. And I quote, the pandemic forced shutdown and the return of breathable air over cities have driven home an important point. The point is the simple pleasure of breathing clean air that people living in cities in Pakistan, India, Nepal, and Bangladesh have almost forgotten in recent decades. And may I add another simple pandemic-induced pleasure? It is the watching the brilliant starlit night sky, which most of those people have forgotten too. Recent studies show that air pollution is linked to significantly higher notes of death in people with COVID-19. The research done in USA calculates that a slightly cleaner air in Manhattan in the past could have saved hundreds of lives. Now, it is not my intention to talk about theory of climate change, nor do I want to persuade you to the truth of climate change. There are others more vocal and knowledgeable who are better able to do that. I'm only going to tell you what I found, how the climate change is affecting and is going to affect increasingly 800 million people in northern Indian subcontinent, and especially 220 million people in Pakistan. The Paris Agreement signed by 196 countries in 2016 has long-term goal not to let the average global temperature to exceed 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial level. And especially if possible to limit the increase to 1.5 degrees. This year, 2020, the average temperature has already increased 1.1 degrees Celsius. And this has put the world on track for warming of more than 3 degrees by the end of this century, if business stays as usual. In June 2017, as you know, President Trump decided his intention to withdraw United States from the Paris Agreement. Now, so much for air pollution and heat. And I like to mention something about the water crisis in northern Indian subcontinent, especially in Pakistan. Because Earth is a unique planet that we have both air and water. World Bank, in its recent report, noted that 2/3 of Pakistanis do not have access to safe drinking water. Other reports put the figure over 90%. There is also a serious overall shortage of water. Report after report by international and Pakistani organizations have given dire warnings. The United Nations Food and Agricultural Organization, FAO, measures the national water stress by calculating water use as a percentage of total renewable water, how much water a country uses and how much water it has potentially there, usable water. Water stress is considered high if the percentage is above 25%. Pakistan's water use is staggering 80%. In other words, there is no chance of coping with any emergency and any bad weather. So 80%, one of the highest in the world. According to FAO, Pakistan will reach absolute water scarcity by 2025, in 5 years' time. Another expert writes, no person in Pakistan, whether from north, with its more than thousands of glaciers on Himalayan mountains, or from the south, with its hyper deserts, will be immune to water shortage by 2025. Take Pakistan's biggest city, Karachi. Karachi draws its water mainly from 2 reservoirs, which get their water from the tail end of the Indus River, just as it flows into the Arabian Sea. The water sources are just not enough for the burgeoning population of Karachi, which is now estimated to be about 25 million. The water need for Karachi is estimated to be 1,200 million gallons a day, but only 500 million gallons is available, of which only 400 million gallons reaches the destination because of leakage and theft. So only 1/3 of what is recommended for the people is available. A writer recently writes in a newspaper, with summer temperatures soaring to 40s Celsius, hundreds and thousands of Karachi residents have once again been forced to rely on expensive private water tanker service as taps across the city have begun to dry out. Although the decrease in commercial and industrial use of water during the extended lockdown for COVID-19 may have alleviated water shortage in some residential areas, the majority of Karachi residents continue to toil with a growing water crisis owing to inadequate water supply and leaky pipelines. The state of injustice is such that while some wealthy areas get their daily water supply, other less fortunate have to wait a week or even a month to get their share. Also due to leakage and water theft, the crisis is most felt by those living farthest from the supply lines. Water tankers in Karachi are part of the main landscape. Initially introduced as a stopgap measure while the authorities were trying to expand the city's water supply infrastructure, they have grown to dominate the sector. Today, there are more than 10,000 water tankers operating across the city, completing roughly 50,000 trips a day. Stealing water in Karachi is an industry worth more than $500 million a year. It is aptly dubbed the water mafia. Writing a water crisis in Karachi, Dinesh Mustafa of King's College London writes, the rights-based approach to water, in other words, that you have a right to water, that water is fundamental right of the people and a fundamental responsibility of the government, has ended. It has been replaced by privatization. Who is now going to make money supplying water to poor people? Where there is money, the water will reach. But where the people are poor, they won't get any water. I quote another recent report. The situation in Karachi reflects a broader water crisis across Pakistan. Inefficient agriculture, dwindling aquifers, increasingly dry environment, rapid demographic growth, and heavy pollution are diminishing both the quantity and quality of water for the residents. And this means that Karachi's water problem and its attendant crime of water theft may become a problem across the rest of Pakistan. One study using multiple water samples from different parts of Karachi showed that over 90% of water samples were simply unfit for drinking using WHO criteria. The water is obviously contaminated everywhere. There are cross connections of water where sewage lines are leaking into water supply lines. Construction practices are such that often sewage lines are side by side with water lines, or even sewage lines above the water lines. But water scarcity is not just confined to Karachi. Take the second biggest city in Pakistan, Lahore, with a population of 12 million. Lahore has always depended on groundwater. The troubling news is that the water table is falling fast, thanks to rapid and unsustainable urbanization. A recently published report by World Wildlife Fund, WWF, World Wildlife Fund, states that water depth in the central part of Lahore has fallen below 40 meters and is projected to drop to below 70 meters by 2025. Obviously, the situation is bleak and calls for urgent measures to avert serious water scarcity. Now, the problem is the only other source of water is the river nearby called Ravi River. The present situation of the river is horrific. And I quote a writer, once a majestic river, the river has been converted into a small polluted drain full of sewage and trash. Lahore produces a discharge of wastewater of 250 million gallons per day, and there are no sewage treatment plants. The waste is dumped in Ravi River, where it seeps to contaminate the groundwater, which is the source of household water. Another report comments, it is alarming that the use of Ravi River for irrigation has been found to be severely harmful to crops. Studies show that toxic impurities in crops irrigated with the river Ravi can be dangerous to human health. River Ravi is only recommended to water flowers. So that's the situation with air pollution and water supply and heat. Now, the next item I'm going to talk is the most important item, which I think is really crucial, and that is the melting of glaciers on Himalayas. Now, glacier, as you know, is a body of dense ice that forms over land and can persist for a few decades to hundreds and thousands of years. Most glaciers are on North and South Pole but there are numerous glaciers on Himalayas. In fact, Himalayas is nowadays called the third pole, North Pole, South Pole, and the third pole. Some 800 million people on the northern Indian subcontinent, from Bangladesh on the east to Pakistan on the west, depend on the water from these glaciers for drinking, irrigation, and hydropower. A study published in 2019, that's the last year, by Professor Schaefer of Columbia and his associates, notes, and I quote, melting of Himalayan glaciers caused by rising temperatures have accelerated dramatically since the start of 21st century. The melting has doubled. The accelerated loss indicated devastating future for the region, devastating future for that's the northern part of India, where 800 to billion people depend on regular water. This is the clearest picture yet how fast Himalayan glaciers are melting. Now, I quote another paragraph from the study, this study. This is a very recent study. It is really the doubling of the speed of glacier melt since the beginning of the century that is most concerning. The new understanding of past melting means a forecast for future can now be made with far more confidence, and the outlook is dire. It looks devastating, and there is no doubt in my mind, not a single grain of doubt, that what we are seeing is the impact of climate change. Temperature data from the region shows that average temperature has increased 1 degree from the previous century. Calculations show this rise is consistent with the amount of ice being lost. For the well-being of the people who depend on the glacial waters, our results are, of course, the worst possible. But it is what it is. And now we have to do something. We have to worry a lot because close to 1 billion people are affected. To stop the temperature rise, we have to cool the planet. We have not only to slow down the greenhouse gas emissions, we have to reverse that. That is the challenge for the next 20 years. So it is not just we reach the carbon neutral level, which we talk about. You have to reverse the whole thing to save those glaciers. Otherwise, you are gone. Those 800 million people are just gone. And Joseph Zahir, professor at University of Northern British Columbia in Canada, who has studied this report, comments, even glaciers in the highest mountains of the world are responding to global warming driven by the combustion of fossil fuels. Another study published last year estimates that the yearly runoff from the Himalayan glaciers is now 1.6 times greater than if the glaciers were replenished at the same rate they were melting. In other words, they are melting faster than the ice is being replenished. As a result, in many high mountain drainage areas, meltwater is threatening downstream communities with potentially destructive and deadly floods. Now, I want to talk a little bit about the formation of glacier lakes, because they have been doing some devastating things in northern parts of India and Pakistan. Now, let me just quickly explain the formation of the glacier lake. When a glacier melts, the melted water flows down, but instead of finding its way to the nearest river, it may be blocked if it encounters another moving glacier. This makes a lake which quietly grows bigger and bigger as more water flows down the mountain. Eventually, the force of the lake water will break open the barrier, and suddenly the lake water will come flooding down on unsuspecting villagers below. Formation of glacial lakes has been known for a long time. In fact, they were described in 19th century. But now with increased glacier melting, they have become very common. Now, there is a Center for International Studies of International Center for Integrated Mountain Development, and it's by Professor David Molden, and often this center works out of Nepal, but it covers all the Himalayas. And last year they submitted an extensive report on Himalayan glaciers, and I just like to quote one or two paragraphs. For generations, farmers in the valley enjoyed a close relationship with the glacier that snakes between two mountain peaks. It watered their fields, orchards, and grazing lands. Now their relationship is unraveling as pollution and global warming is causing the glacier to melt and form unstable lakes that could burst their icy banks at any moment. Already this summer of 2019, that's last year, much of cultivated lands below have been destroyed by glacial floods. More than 300 glaciers have formed numerous unstable lakes. At least 30 lakes are at the risk of bursting, which can trigger ice avalanches and flash floods that will bring down water, debris, and boulders. The other problem is that water canals carved and built into the mountainside have long been used by residents of the higher valleys to tap glacier melt to provide water to the villages. But as the glaciers behave more erratically, surging, shrinking, and flooding, many of these canals have been blocked. Okay, David Molden, who did the study last year, but I just want to quote my paragraph from him. If we stick to the present emission trends, we will lose 2/3 of our glaciers. Even if warming is limited to 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, as called by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC in its 2018 report, the mountains will lose more than 1/3 of their ice, largely held in glaciers. The direction is pretty clear on where we are going, and that's alarming news. The impact will reverberate downstream because glacial melt feeds the Indus River Basin, Pakistan's main source for over 200 million people as it courses towards the Arabian Sea. So that part is where the Pakistan is, the Indus River. And Indus River, Pakistan depends on Indus River for everything, for drinking water, for irrigation, for hydro. Now, Dr. Molden sort of realizes that it's caused by the global warming. And some of the people in the Indian subcontinent will say, well, we didn't bring about the global warming. The Western countries did, because they were the first to industrialize. But Dr. Molden does not forgive the Asian countries. And I quote what he said: regional factors, in other words, regional countries, are also accelerating glacier melt, including smog and toxic smog that chokes South Asia through the winter. Air pollution leaves dark soot on glaciers around in Himalayas. Governments are not acting to prevent this. So it's not all fault of the Western countries. The local governments who are going to be affected are not doing their best. So glacier melting is now the very big problem. Now glaciers are melting and the water is going into the ocean. So ocean is rising. We all know that with global warming, the ocean is rising because this is one of the known feature of global warming, that due to the global warming, the melting of the cryosphere, as it's called, all the frozen ice around the world, the sea is rising. Okay, the sea has risen. Global temperature has risen about 1 degree Celsius since in the pre-industrial level, and the sea level has risen so far 6 to 8 inches. That is significant. There are two reasons for expansion, sea level rise. One is the thermal expansion, because with the global warming, sea gets warm, and water expands. So without any melting of the cryosphere, just with global warming, seawater will rise. But melting cryosphere, all the glaciers and ice, and that is adding to the rise of the sea. Now, you have probably heard the ice shields on Greenland and Antarctica melting very fast in the last few years. In fact, in the last couple of weeks, some of you may have read the report that the ice sheet on Greenland may have reached the tipping point. Now, a tipping point is a change in the climate system. When the climate system crosses a threshold, triggering a situation when the change in the climate system becomes independent become independent of the cause which is causing the problem. So the climate system, the change becomes irreversible. In other words, if Greenland ice shield is melting and it has reached its tipping point, then you can't stop it melting. Even if you reverse the greenhouse gases and bring it back to zero, you can't stop it. So it has reached a tipping point. And there was a news in the last couple of weeks in the newspaper that there is a fear that ice sheet on Greenland, which has been melting significantly, may have reached its tipping point. And there is a danger that in future, the Antarctica may reach a tipping point. Now, if Antarctica reaches a tipping point and you can't control its melting, and if it melts, the ocean will rise 250 feet. And that will finish us all. So anyway, that's the tipping point. Now, okay, sea levels are rising. So what rising sea levels are doing? One of the things it's doing is eroding the coast. And let's now concentrate what it's doing to Pakistan's coast. Here is a recent warning by Chief of Pakistan's National Institute of Oceanography, and I quote, "If the current trend of coastal erosion of the Indus Delta continues unchecked, 3 cities on the coast will be submerged in the next few decades. One of those is Karachi, Pakistan's biggest city, with a population of 25 million, which would be underwater by 2060. The other two, Baden and Thatta, would drown by 2050. Many coastal areas have already been submerged due to rising sea level. We attribute this doomsday scenario to climate crisis as well as unplanned development on coastal areas." And he goes on to say, dams built on Indus and its tributaries, and there are numerous dams built over the years, have accelerated delta erosion. Large amounts of sediment were historically brought down by Indus River and deposited along the lower stretches to form one of the biggest deltas in the world. By damming of the Indus River and use of its water for drinking and irrigation has drastically reduced river flow and sediment load downstream. Erosion is intensified by storm surging of the rising ocean. And during Indus floods, water flow is so strong that all the sediment flushes away into the sea. Another study, and I quote, recent study, the sea intrusion has already inundated more than 3.5 million acres of farmland in the Delta area. Mangrove forests have been steadily depleted, leaving the region vulnerable to greater damage from storm flooding. Hundreds and thousands of people who lived on the Indus Delta have emigrated from the area and gone somewhere else. All the land has been swallowed by the rising Arabian Sea. And a final comment from a man who left Delta, and he looks back on it. He recalls the 1960s when they grew rice and other crops in the Delta. They fished in the Delta and the sea. The Delta then produced 5,000 tons of fish, but the catch has now slumped to only 300 tons. Only few people still live there. More than 80% have moved away. So Indus River Delta may have passed the tipping point. Now I'm going to pass about the spread of diseases, because this is something which is fairly obvious, because the rising temperature is causing the spread of diseases, especially of malaria in Pakistan, and also dengue fever, malaria particularly. Malaria at one time was almost completely eliminated because of DDT spray, but then because of the side effects of DDT, it was banned and malaria came back. Now it is spreading quite fast and is one of the deadliest diseases in tropics, along with dengue fever. They both are very common. But the other problem with increasing temperature is the contaminated water and food, which causes diarrheal disease. WHO has made a recent report on diarrheal diseases in Pakistan, where it said that by 2030, that's in 10 years, there will be 20% increase in the diarrheal diseases in Pakistan. And it will primarily affect the health of young children, especially those who already suffer from malnutrition. Okay, now I want to talk a bit about population, and that is the most difficult subject to deal with. I've read a lot about population, so-called population problem, and I've been familiar with it, like most of you perhaps, for years and years. But it's very difficult to put your head around this problem. But as somebody said, whichever way you look at climate crisis, you end up with population. Now, the population problem, as you know, was first highlighted by Reverend Thomas Malthus in 1798. He was the one who projected the theory that the rise in population will always outstrip food production. So eventually there will be a famine, unless the people die of disease or starvation or something. And so that was, but Thomas' theory sort of was in the background. And one thing who really put Thomas's theory on front burner in 1958 was Paul Ehrlich. Now, you may be familiar, if you are old enough to remember 1958. When Paul Ehrlich wrote his book, it became very famous. It was called The Population Bomb. And it became like a bestseller all over the world. We all knew The Population Bomb. It was written in a very dramatic style. And it prophesied that by end of 20th century, hundreds and millions of people would die of starvation, especially in India and China. India and China was the focus. He said the population cannot survive 20th century before being eliminated to a large degree. And Paul Ehrlich became very famous. He was on television, popular shows many times. And so his book became the Bible for the people. But in fact, that didn't happen. And that famine didn't come about because not the population didn't increase, it did increase, but there were better crops, seeds were developed, and high yield crops were introduced. So the population bomb was prevented. Now, Paul Ehrlich is still alive. He's in his 90s. And I've seen him on television being interviewed. He still feels that though his projections did not come about because he did not foresee the better insecticides, better fertilizers, and better crop seeds. And but he still feels that it's something good because it focused our attention on population. And he thinks that, in one of the interviews, he thinks that the best amount of population on this world should be no more than 2 or 3 billion. And that won't happen, of course, because we have 8 billion people living now. So, but anyway, that was the scary thing about population. So population of Pakistan is 220 million. It makes Pakistan the 5th largest country in the world, 5th largest, after China, India, United States, and Indonesia. So 5th largest country, and a relatively small area. It's 220, and its population is rising at 2.4%, which is alarmingly high still. It's gone down a bit, but it's alarmingly high, and one of the highest growth rate outside sub-Saharan Africa. According to a prominent Pakistani expert, and I quote, chief causes of continuing population surge include religious taboos, political timidity, and public ignorance. Only a third of married Pakistani women use any form of birth control. And the only family planning method sanctioned by most Islamic clerics is spacing birth by breastfeeding of the infants. Even if the birth rate slows, it is estimated that Pakistan's population could double again by mid-century, putting catastrophic pressures on water and sanitation systems, swamping already beleaguered health and education services, and leaving tens of millions of people jobless. Prime recruits for criminal networks and violent Islamist groups. So Pakistan is in a very difficult situation at the moment because it's going to have a population bulge as going into the mid-century. Another Pakistani expert writes, the exploding population has put the entire country's future in jeopardy, with 60% of the population younger than 30, 60% younger than 30. Nearly a third of Pakistanis living in poverty and only 58% literate. This is a disaster in the making. Now, it goes without saying that population growth in itself is not the direct cause of global warming. Burning fossil fuels is. And though it is you can say, well, it's the people who burn fossil fuels. They burn them at different rates in different countries. And that's one of the difficulties when you address population. Now, Under current conditions, a child born in the United States will be responsible for almost 7 times the carbon emissions of a child born in China, and 30 times the impact of a child born in Bangladesh. But still, some people recommend, in a study published in 2017 by University of Lund in Switzerland and British Columbia, suggested that the single most effective measure an individual in the developed world will take is to cut their carbon emission over long term was to have one fewer child. That one fewer child in the developed world is equivalent to having 30 or 40 less children in the poor countries. But the problem is that fertility rate is already quite low in Western countries. And cutting fertility rate further is not very likely. A more appropriate recommendation was made last year in a statement signed by more than 13,000 scientists from around the world, which explicitly calls for bold and drastic transformations regarding both economic and population policies, including family planning services available to all, achieving full gender equity in all countries. Now that's a little more practical. If you try to do it in all countries, and doing in some without doing the other is probably not going to be very effective. Now, the other thing is, complication with population is the recent studies have eased the threat of population growth, as you probably know. Though some countries like Pakistan will continue to see an increase in their population, more and more countries will see a steady decline. Of interest is a study published in the medical journal Lancet last month, which projects the world population to only reach 8.8 billion by the end of this century. Unlike the United Nations prediction, which was that the population will reach 11 billion by the end of the century. Now, that is quite a dramatic increase. Instead of 11 billion, we are seeing 8.8 billion by the end of the century, and it's almost 8 billion now. So this idea of overpopulation, that's a threat of overpopulation, which we have always heard about, is probably not going to come to pass. But the problem is that the increase and decrease in population is affecting different countries. Some countries like Canada have been showing, and USA is also showing decrease in population. And there are about more than 23 countries now which are showing decrease in population. Now, there are other countries like Pakistan and Sub-Saharan Africa which will continue to show increase in population. And there will be sizable population in other countries like India, perhaps not China. While there are other countries, now Canada is trying to get immigrants from overpopulated countries because Canada knows that its population otherwise will go down and it will become economically unsustainable. But there are other countries like Japan and Hungary which are refusing to admit any immigrants. They want to stay as they are and see what comes. Now, Hungary is trying to encourage its population to have more children, but whether this has been done before and hasn't worked. So anyway, there is the threat of population is now has been alleviated somewhat, but the unequal distribution of population across the world is there, and there is no obvious solution. There are some writers who say, well, we have got a lot of land. USA is so thinly populated, for example, and it can accommodate as many people as its current population. But where those people are going to come from? They're going to come from places like Pakistan, Sub-Saharan Africa, India. And will the Americans be willing to take people from there? It's unlikely they will be in a large number. But anyway, the situation is becoming quite complicated, not only because of the different forecasts for population, but now we have COVID-19, and that has entered into the equation. And we don't know how the COVID-19 is going to play out as far as the population is concerned. It may discourage people to have more children anyway. We don't know what's going to do. But anyway, so summarize the presentation. Pakistan has now, and some of the northern India, I concentrated on Pakistan because that's my home country. And Pakistan has now some serious problems. And the difficulty with Pakistan is that since inception in 1947, it has wasted enormous resources on fruitless wars, on military, on developing nuclear weapons. Now, what was the need of developing nuclear weapons? It spent so much of these resources on developing nuclear weapons. And its funding of healthcare and education has been minimum, really. Negligible amount of money was left for healthcare and education. And we are seeing the results now, where it's facing problems of increasing heat, polluted air, diminishing water, melting glaciers, uncontrolled population growth, and there are not resources available to face those problems. So I feel that Pakistan particularly is facing an existential problem because of the climate crisis, for which it has not been prepared. Thank you. Hello, Andre.
Hello, Dr. Zahir. It's all terribly interesting. You know, for a long time, I've been viewing the small steps that I've taken from, you know, driving less to just making sure that I bring the non-city recyclables to, you know, the recycling when I'm on the other side of the bridge is tiny things. But it's interesting how many tiny things you can do to make a difference. Because it's inescapable. It's in the back of one's mind all the time. And one can see it in the media daily, and even in all of the fiction that I read, it certainly shows up a great deal.
Well, I try to concentrate on recent newspapers and media so that I found out what is happening there, what people are writing on day to day about this problem, and who is suffering, and people being interviewed, and so that you get a sense of what is going on the ground, not necessarily depending on government reports, which sometimes try to show you the bright side of things.
Yeah, and you know, oftentimes these days the bright side of things isn't really the way it's going. But I do like to look at us as citizens of a more than just, you know, our own country, but of a planet, and hopefully in so doing, we can consider the lives of our friends who live elsewhere and their well-being as well.
That's right. Well, we'll see how it goes. Yeah.
Well, I wanted to thank you so much for coming and discussing this with us tonight. We do have, well, this looks a bit backwards to me, but this is Dr. Zahir's, it is actually 1947, 1947. So if you would like to read a little bit about the memoir of Indian independence, please let your library know. We've got copies. And before I go, I just wanted to share with you a couple of our upcoming events. For our youth, we've got one of our final summer reading club activities for both the teens and the adults, a virtual escape room. So through Zoom, you get to guide our staff to escape from the International Space Station before time runs out. So I'm really glad that's virtual. The other thing is we're actually very, very fortunate to have more fall programming and another virtual author talk. Our Vancouver Island author and retired atmospheric and climate scientist, Jeff Strong, will also be sharing his latest book, Inconvenient Pipeline, which is an environmental thriller set in Merritt. It's an environmental thriller set in Merritt. So, yeah, and that's coming up quite soon too. I hope you enjoyed this evening, and thanks so much again, Dr. Zahir, for joining us. Hopefully we'll have a chance to chat with you again soon.
Thank you very much, Andre, for organizing it. Thank you.
You're very welcome.
Thank you, anybody who is listening. Thank you very much.
Have a great evening, Dr. Zahir.
Thank you.